coming at you. All right, so we did MySQL for our database, and we're gonna talk about what all that means. We're gonna go into the architecture, the vulnerabilities, and the upgrade path from 5.5 all the way to 8.0. 8.0 is the current, well, 8 is the current version. They're on point something by now, but 8's where we're currently at. Tim Comerford has a doctor's appointment, so he was supposed to go last, but we're having him go first. So this presentation is going to be a little bit out of order, but we want Tim to participate as team captain. So yeah, Tim, get up here.
All right, thank you. Hi everybody, I'm Tim Comerford. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about MySQL. All right, first let's talk about user privileges. All user privileges in MySQL are given to the user via the grant, and you can actually give other users the grant as well through the grant option command. The grant is a very important part of everything you do in MySQL. In fact, you can't even view tables without specific grants to be able to view them. The grants are also seem to be a little bit more granular than it was for the Microsoft SQL, because grants can be global for all databases within a repository. They can be database. They can be based off the table, based off the column. They also have ones for certain scripts, and they have ones for proxy as well. Yeah, and these are the privilege levels for MySQL. So the store routine is all the functions that you can do in MySQL. We did a little bit of it last semester for those who were in the class. Vulnerabilities. So originally in 5.7, if you do the show grant statements, it showed the hash values for if the user has the super privilege, so you can get people's hashed passwords. So the show grant no longer brings up account passwords as of 5.7, but also in 8.0 it explicitly lists each grant. Under the original version of it before 8.0, it just if you had all privileges, it just had all privileges. Now it lists exactly what your privileges are for your account. Update and patch. Patching is an important part of anything you have. Everything that you have on your computer should be patched and updated as long as it's viable and it makes sense. Sometimes patches aren't the best, and sometimes they can be broken. But you should patch pretty frequently, and you should have a plan in place for patching. And it's not really easy for MySQL, at least originally. Like there are so many vulnerabilities for MySQL. If you can see the number there, it's 1,726 vulnerabilities that they have listed. And this is just from 5.5. MySQL actually started before 5.5, but it wasn't generally distributed until 5.5. It's very important in MySQL that you upgrade just one version at a time. You can't go from MySQL 5.5 to 8.0. If you did, it generally would break tables. Like you would have a hard time getting your tables to work or the queries to work. Supported data types. Okay, so MySQL supports all of these data types, including some newer data types for geolocation and for spatial data. As of 5.5, there was no microseconds option for the data. As of 5.6, 5.7, and 8, they installed it. But now for 5.6, 5.7, and 8.0, if you actually try to return rows with the NODB, which is, it changed from 5.5 to 5.6. They used to have another database function, but as of 5.6, everything goes to NODB. But if you do not actually set the default value of it to 1, if you have 3 or more characters, I mean 3 or less characters, excuse me, it doesn't return anything when you do a query. And this is where it explains that.
really great work, Tim. All right, we're back to the beginning. So this is, we were going in chronological order where we'd start. So I'm going to talk about architecture. So MySQL utilizes a database connection manager to connect to your server, and this is done over TCP. Uses a query engine that is optimized for speed instead of resources. So a big drawing point of MySQL is that the database is designed, or the query engine is designed for speed. Every other major database in existence is optimized for resources, so MySQL can be pretty quick in its transactions. So it uses a query cache, and a query cache just stores previous queries. That way, if you call the same one or something similar, it can pull it out of the memory a lot quicker, hence why it's optimized for speed. Has transaction management that prevents deadlocks, and it uses its InnoDB and DVD to do this. It is ACID compliant, as we learned a couple of weeks ago in this class. Gotta love ACID. Administrators can make it non-compliant though by changing default settings. But once again, ACID is the default setup for MySQL. The storage management for the databases takes place in its main memory. It's done in a 3-tiered system though. Resource, buffer, and storage management are all the different tiers. Admins can control which tables are placed into which storage engine. So admins have a lot of functionality in terms of the tier list of storage, and this allows for increased security. Vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities associated with the architecture are literally just anything that can be exploited by how the database is designed. So for instance, the fact that you connect to the database over TCP can be exploited if the connection is not secure. If you did this over public Wi-Fi, someone could probably figure out your passwords and then boom, insecure. But the vulnerabilities you're going to find through the architecture are the ones that are just made into the system, and can only be patched out over time as people realize, hey, maybe this isn't the best way to go about it. So upgrades and issues. So in the top right, you'll see the architecture layout for version 8. So this is what the architecture currently looks like for MySQL. NDB cluster capabilities improved with every patch. So what I'm saying, there's from 5.5 all the way to 8.0. The capabilities of the NDB clusters were improved. Basically what that looks like is they got quicker at processing what they do. They use less resources. Their storage got larger. There was some form of patch like that that happened every single time. 5.6 introduced transaction management performance limiting. So before, you never had any choice in how your transaction management happened. The performance was always just running at top speed. For InnoDB was improved across the board. So at every single patch, InnoDB received an update, much like NDB cluster. 5.7 introduced GTIDs and table space encryption. So GTIDs are unique identifiers that tell you, or that are placed on each transaction. So anytime a transaction goes across the database, they get a GTID. 8.0 improved table space encryption to cover undo and redo logs. That way you could verify that your logs were encrypted and not, being transmitted in plain text and being changed. We're going to go to installation now, which is with Mike.
Hello, excuse me. Hello, everyone. I'm Mike Morlatos, and I'll be covering installation. So essentially, what we find here with installation, it's pretty straightforward. When you go onto the website on how to install, you have to determine what distribution format you want and what specific source code you are looking for. And once you're able to take that file and that code, you're able to configure it and just fit it to whatever needs that you're looking for. So that source code that you decide on, it allows you to download the MySQL package. So within Windows, there's 3 different packages. There's the complete package, the essentials package, and the no install archive package. Within the first 2 packages, there are the setup wizards. This just allows, that comes in the actual package itself. And usually what is recommended is the essentials package. But with the essentials package as well, there is, you can't do any more configuration. Whatever is given is what you're able to deal with. You can't configure anything else. So if you're hoping to configure more on your own, maybe the complete package will allow that to, more freedom for that aspect. And then the third package comes with no setup wizard. This allows for more configuration on your own. And like I said, when you go through the website, it kind of goes through the step-by-step process on how to go about installing the different versions with MySQL. So the vulnerabilities are, again, straightforward, as we've always covered in our cyber classes. Human error is the biggest issue when it comes to the vulnerabilities. It will be a lack of research of what your actual needs are, and service level reading and research. Just not doing not a lot of research into what actually you are trying to download, all the things that may be necessary, what you may need to configure, and again, laziness. And so people are kind of going into downloading MySQL and not really having a full idea of what they all need to do to have a successful running MySQL. So the precautions that are put into place to combat this is to have default users, default user accounts. So that's basically having one default user account, and setting up passwords during the installation just to help have a lot more of a smooth process. But the main vulnerability we see here is just through human error, and users not having adequate knowledge as to what they are trying to achieve when they're downloading MySQL. So how to upgrade and any upgrade issues. So like we were just covering in the vulnerabilities aspect, it is a fairly complex process to download. When you go to their site, we're not going to go to the site itself, but I have it linked on the slide. You'll see that there's many steps on how to successfully download MySQL, which distribution format you want, and which operating system it will be applied to. So this is just a process that you have to follow pretty strictly so you don't run into any issues. And then if you run into any issues, that's where the vulnerabilities start to come into place. So if you go into with a patient mindset, then you'll generally have success. So the installation guide, it tells you all the information you need to know when downloading, tells you how to upgrade and also shows you how to downgrade. If there's any reason why you would want to go from version 5.7 down back to 5.6, it has a step-by-step process as to how to achieve that and how to go about that.
So I'm going to talk about auditing, everyone's favorite thing. Gotta know it, gotta love it. So auditing for databases is basically just tracking what is happening in your database of transactions that are processing, what users are calling what commands, what admins are using what privileges. So for MySQL, version 5.5 only allowed third-party applications to do that. So there was no default auditing software built into MySQL as a version 5.5. As a result, administrators had to make sure that they installed something, or they just had no way to track anything that was happening on their servers through an auditing application because it didn't exist. All other versions of MySQL add a built-in auditing tool, but it is only for the enterprise edition of MySQL. So if you get one of the other editions that Mike was talking about, you'll still have to use third-party applications. The vulnerabilities for this, if you don't have an auditing tool, how are you going to know what's happening? So obviously adding either the third-party tools necessary or getting the enterprise edition can help know exactly what's happening on your database. So if it looks like on your end that security administrators are doing their work on your server, but in reality an auditing tool would tell you it's not them because they're logging in at weird times and your administrator is probably not doing that, you would know. And if you don't have that tool, that's a vulnerability. Third-party apps, each one can have their own vulnerability. If you're installing third-party software, the other company is liable for the vulnerability, but obviously you're assuming that risk by downloading it and installing it into your system. So that's specific to each app that you add to your database. And Mike's back up to talk about upgrades.
Yeah. Thanks. So just upgrade and upgrade issues, Xavier summarized it pretty well. So from what we found through the process of the different versions, there is extensions added for auditing, but like Xavier says, only for the Enterprise Edition. It will be required of the admin to just make sure that there are other applications that are performing auditing functions, because obviously if there is no other application performing that, then we're in a bit of a doozy of a situation, because we need to know what's going on, like Xavier said. So if you have an edition outside the Enterprise Edition, it will be up to the admin to just ensure that other applications are performing those auditing functions. And at the bottom right of the screen, it shows just like a little diagram of how auditing is being performed with the various different hosts.
Okay, so about authentication, it's pretty simple. For version 5.5, the user identification is verified by the host name for which the server is running on, a user supplied username, as well as a user supplied password. So obviously this is important to make sure the person who is authorized to access the server. And then the later version is about the pluggable authentication and external authentication methods. So the vulnerabilities for authentication is that the connection is only permitted if the host and user matches the client host name as well as the username, and that the client supplies the password. And with the upgrades, it's very simple. It offers a more secure authentication plugins, so such as migrating from the previous 4.1 password hashing. Pretty simple.
So I'm going to talk about the default user accounts. So for version 5.5, which is where the book starts, there are 4 default accounts created automatically. 2 of those accounts are root accounts, one for connections from the local host and one for remote connections. And then there's also 2 anonymous accounts created. 5.6 is the same. And then for versions 5.7 and 8.0, only one root account is created by default. And for the earlier versions, the default accounts have no password set up by default, but 5.7 and 8.0 sometimes create a password by default in the installation process, depending on how you do it. So the vulnerabilities associated with this are, of course, the default root account for the more current version, and whether or not it has a password that's created. Depending on the installation process, if you do get a password created during that process, it might be a randomly generated password that ends up in the server error log, which you probably then want to change. And then another thing to be aware of is correcting the configuration so that you're aware of what accounts can connect remotely, especially for the root account. So reasons to use a more current upgraded version include that fewer default accounts are created, especially for that root account. And you'll get a password probably set up during the installation process. And by default, the configuration should be set up so that root is not able to connect remotely.
Hello everybody. Password policies. In 5.5, passwords are storing in a 45-bit encryption in the user table. In 5.6, the plugin used to enforce policy on acceptable passwords. And then 5.7 is the same as 5.6, and then you guessed it, 8.0 is the same as 5.7. And so the vulnerabilities for this, when I saw this, is a little interesting. No password enforcement provided for policy enforcement. Database administrator has to rely on an operating system and a third-party application. Upgrades and upgrade issues. Admins employ a plugin to enforce password policy, allowing them to be trained and to connect to the server that keeps their password secure.
So for roles, in version 5.5 and 5.6 and 5.7, there is no MySQL system to create roles. So administrators have to use scripting or third-party applications to provide that function. As of version 8.0, there is a role-based privilege granting system that's been introduced. So the vulnerabilities that introduces for the earlier versions is that if you're installing third-party applications or scripts, those could potentially have vulnerabilities, or they could even be malicious. So you have to do research to ensure that you're not introducing new vulnerabilities into your system. So reasons to upgrade the role system is provided in the current version, but a challenge that you would face with that is then migrating from a third-party system to the MySQL system.
I'm back. All right, so admin privileges. Description: 2 root accounts created by default. One root is the local connections. The second is the remote access. No passwords are assigned by the default. Versions 5.6 is the same as 5.5, and version 5.7, only one default account root is created. So this vulnerability, with no passwords assigned to anyone, can have access to the admin's account unless that gets changed. Now, Shane, what do you think that vulnerability is on a scale of 1 to 10? That's a pretty big 10, and that's pretty bad. In the upgrade issues, versions 8.0 improves on previous versions by only creating one default admin level account. So we saw there before that they used to be able to make 2 root accounts. Now you can only make 1, and the only way to get in there is if you know the password.
So finally, we just have a quick overview of how you would upgrade between release series, so like from 5.6 to 5.7 or 5.7 to 8.0. So the first thing to do is to make a backup when you're upgrading any kind of server, so you can revert back to what you had before if something goes wrong. The second step would be to check for incompatibility issues. MySQL has a lot of documentation about this, where they list problems that you might face upgrading between release series and steps you can take to address those issues. And it would also be a good idea to do more research just on the internet in different forums to see if other people have faced additional problems. But there's a pretty long list here. Then you would have to find the appropriate tool depending on what kind of server you're using. So if you have a Windows installation, you would use the Windows zip archive tool. And if you're using a Linux system, then you would probably do a logical upgrade where you back up the data, then install the new server version, and then reload the data. And there's also a couple of other options that aren't recommended for upgrading between release series, but can be used for Linux. And then after that, regardless of which upgrade method you used, you would use this MySQL upgrade script, which is used for all versions prior to 8.0.16. At that point, the server will perform these tasks automatically and you don't need to run the script. But before then, you do need to run this script. And what it will do is examine the tables for incompatibilities with the new version, and then attempt to repair them if there are problems, and then upgrade the system database to let you use the new privileges and capabilities of the upgraded version. So that's it. Thank you.
Any questions? All right.